The world had not always been this unforgiving, but over time it had reshaped itself into something far harsher than anyone had imagined. Once, there were spaces for the weak to breathe, for kindness to exist without being exploited, and for trust to hold meaning. But as resources tightened and fear spread quietly through societies, everything began to change. People stopped helping and started calculating. Every interaction became a silent test of strength, awareness, and intent. In this new order, hesitation was dangerous, and compassion often became a liability. The rules were no longer spoken, yet everyone understood them: adapt, dominate, or disappear. It was not cruelty that defined the world anymore. It was necessity. And necessity had no room for weakness. Arman had not entered this world as a predator. He had been shaped into one by the slow, relentless pressure of survival. There was a time when he believed in fairness, when he thought effort would lead to reward and honesty would protect him. But reality dismantled those beliefs piece by piece. Each betrayal stripped away his innocence, and each failure taught him lessons he could not ignore. He began observing people differently, not as individuals with emotions, but as patterns to understand and predict. Fear, ambition, greed, these became signals rather than feelings. What others saw as human connection, he started seeing as opportunity or threat. His transformation was not sudden, it was gradual, almost invisible, until one day he realized he no longer reacted to the world, he anticipated it. As Arman grew into this new mindset, the city around him became less of a place and more of a battlefield. Power did not belong to the loudest or the strongest, but to those who understood timing and strategy. He learned to move quietly, to let others reveal their weaknesses while he remained unreadable. Instead of confronting problems head-on, he shaped situations to his advantage. A conversation placed at the right moment, a decision delayed just long enough, a risk taken when no one expected it. These became his tools. While others exhausted themselves in visible sangharsh, Arman advanced through patience and precision. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he climbed higher, leaving behind those who failed to see the game he was playing. Yet with every step upward, something within him began to change in ways he had not anticipated. The connections he once valued faded into transactions, and trust became something he used rather than something he felt. Success brought security, but it also brought isolation. There were no true allies at the top, only shifting alliances and hidden threats. Even moments of victory felt strangely hollow, as if they lacked the meaning he once imagined they would carry. In quieter moments, when there was no one to observe or outmaneuver, a question lingered in his mind. What had he traded for this position? But in a world that punished hesitation, even self-reflection felt dangerous, like a crack that could undo everything he had built. Standing above the city one night, watching its endless motion, Arman reached a realization that was both unsettling and clear. The world had not forced him to become a predator. It had simply revealed a part of him that had always been there. And he understood something even deeper. The cycle never ends. No matter how powerful one becomes, there is always another mind, calculating, another presence waiting for the right moment to strike. Survival of the fittest was not a victory to achieve, but a continuous state of being. For the first time, he allowed himself a quiet smile, not from triumph, but from understanding. In this world, no one truly escapes the hunt. They only change roles within it. The city never truly slept, but Arman had learned that its quietest moments were the most dangerous. It was in silence that decisions were made, alliances were broken, and futures were rewritten. He had reached a level where people no longer questioned him openly, yet he could feel the shift, subtle, almost invisible. Eyes lingered a little longer. Conversations paused when he entered. Respect and fear had blended into something indistinguishable. And in that mixture, Arman recognized the same pattern he once studied in others, the early signs of resistance. Somewhere someone was watching him the way he once watched the powerful, patiently, carefully, waiting. For the first time in years, Arman did not act immediately. Instead, he observed. He allowed small irregularities to exist, minor challenges to surface, and quiet tensions to grow. It was not weakness, it was strategy. A true predator did not react impulsively. He let the prey reveal itself. Days turned, into weeks, and slowly a shape began to form. It wasn't a single person, but a network. Subtle connections between individuals who, on the surface, seemed unrelated. A shared glance here, a repeated name there, a pattern of movement that didn't quite fit. Someone was building something beneath the surface, something that mirrored the very path Arman had taken. What unsettled him wasn't the threat itself, it was the familiarity of it. He could see his own methods reflected back at him, refined, and perhaps even improved. Whoever was behind this understood not just the system, but him. That realization shifted something inside Arman. For years, he had believed that reaching the top meant control. But now he saw the flaw in that belief. Control was temporary. Dominance was fragile. The moment you became visible, you became a target, and perhaps without realizing it, he had already stepped into the role he once hunted. Instead of tightening his grip, Arman did something unexpected. He stepped back. Not visibly, not enough for others to notice, but just enough to disrupt the expectations forming around him. He changed patterns, delayed decisions, and introduced uncertainty into the system he once ran with precision. It was a risk, but it was necessary. A predator who refuses to adapt becomes predictable, and predictability is the beginning of defeat. For the first time, Arman wasn't just playing the game. He was questioning its rules, testing its limits, searching for something beyond the endless cycle of dominance. And yet, deep down, he understood a truth he could not escape, no matter how much he adapted, how carefully he moved, or how deeply he understood the system. The cycle would continue. Someone would always rise. Someone would always challenge. The world did not reward stillness. It demanded evolution. As he stood, once again overlooking the city, Arman no longer saw it as something to control. He saw it for what it truly was, a living system of constant ସଂഘર્ष, where predators and prey were not fixed identities, but shifting roles. And this time, his expression did not carry certainty or satisfaction. It carried awareness. Because in the end, survival was not about winning. It was about never becoming easy to defeat. The first real crack did not come as an attack. It came as absence. A deal that should have closed smoothly collapsed without explanation. A loyal contact stopped responding. Information that once flowed freely now arrived incomplete, distorted, or too late to matter. Arman recognized the pattern immediately, not because it was obvious, but because it was precise. This wasn't chaos. It was control through subtraction. Someone wasn't trying to defeat him directly. They were weakening the structure around him, piece by piece, until his strength meant nothing. It was a method Arman himself had once used, and that realization settled heavily in his mind. He resisted the urge to strike back blindly. Instead, he narrowed his focus, tracing the disruptions like threads in a larger design. Every missing piece pointed toward an intelligence that valued patience over power. Whoever this was, they were not interested in quick victories. They were building inevitability. Arman adjusted his movements again, becoming less visible, less predictable, almost as if he were erasing himself from the system he once dominated. But the more he adapted, the clearer it became. This opponent wasn't reacting to him. They were anticipating him. It felt less like a confrontation and more like a conversation where the other side was always one step ahead. Days later, the message finally arrived. No name, no demand, just a single line. You taught the world how to hunt. Now watch it hunt you. Arman read it more than once, not out of confusion, but to absorb the intent behind it. This wasn't intimidation, it was acknowledgement. Whoever stood behind this did not see him as just a target, but as a predecessor, a foundation. That changed everything. This was no longer about territory or control, it was about evolution. The predator he had become had inspired something new, something that did not intend to replace him, but to surpass him. For the first time in a long while, Arman felt something close to clarity. Fear was absent, but so was certainty. He understood. Now that fighting this the way he had fought others would fail. Strength, influence, strategy. Those were expected, predictable. If he wanted to survive this, he had to become something beyond what he had been. Not a stronger predator, but a different kind altogether. One that could operate outside the patterns he himself had created. It was a dangerous shift, because it meant letting go of the very mindset that had brought him this far. That night, as the city lights flickered beneath him, Arman made a decision that would either save him or erase him completely. He would stop playing as the apex predator. Instead, he would disappear into the system, become unseen, untraceable, undefined. Not prey, not predator, but something in between. Because for the first time, he understood the flaw in the world's rule. Survival of the fittest did not belong to the strongest hunter. It belonged to the one who could no longer be classified. And somewhere in the same city, hidden in the same darkness, another mind was already waiting to see what he would become next. Arman's disappearance did not create silence. It created confusion. Systems he once controlled began to behave unpredictably, as if they were searching for him and failing to adapt to his absence. But hidden beneath that surface disorder, something else was happening. The unseen force that had been closing in on him did not accelerate. It paused. That pause told Arman everything. His opponent had expected resistance, retaliation, escalation, but not absence. For the first time, Arman had stepped outside the pattern, and in doing so, he had forced the hunter to question the hunt itself. Days passed with no direct move, yet the tension only deepened. Arman moved through the city like a shadow, observing fragments of a system he once ruled completely. He noticed subtle corrections, small adjustments being made by the hidden mind behind it all. This was no ordinary rival. Every decision carried intention, every silence carried meaning. It was as if the entire city had become a chessboard where both players refused to touch the pieces, waiting instead for the other to reveal their true strategy. And in that stillness, Arman realized something unsettling. This was no longer about control of territory. It was a test of understanding. Then, without warning, the second message arrived. This time, it wasn't just words. It was a location. An old structure on the edge of the city, abandoned long ago, irrelevant to anyone who still played by ordinary rules. Arman didn't hesitate, but he didn't rush either. He understood the nature of this invitation. It wasn't a trap in the traditional sense. It was a statement, "I know you well enough to predict that you will come." And that alone made it dangerous. Because if his opponent could predict his choice, then the real trap wasn't the location. It was the expectation behind it. When Arman finally stepped into the building, the silence felt deliberate, almost constructed. There were no guards, no obvious threats, no signs of force, just space. And, at the center of it, a single presence. Not surrounded by power, not hidden behind layers of protection, but standing alone with quiet certainty. The figure did not move immediately, did not speak right away. That confidence, that lack of urgency, told Arman everything he needed to know. This was not someone who feared losing. This was someone who had already calculated every outcome. "You adapted," the figure finally said, voice calm, almost analytical. But not far enough. Arman didn't respond immediately. He studied the person in front of him, not just their face, but their posture, their stillness, the absence of unnecessary movement. And then it clicked, not identity in the simple sense, but understanding. This wasn't just an opponent. This was a continuation. Someone who had taken everything Arman had built, the methods, the mindset, the philosophy, and refined it beyond recognition, not driven by survival alone, but by something colder, something more precise. And for the first time, Arman understood. The real shift in the game. This was no longer predator versus predator. This was evolution confronting its own origin. Continuation. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence between Arman and the figure wasn't empty. It was loaded, calculated, almost alive. Arman had faced powerful enemies before, but this felt different. There was no visible threat, no aggression, no urgency, just certainty. And certainty, in a world built on survival, was the most dangerous thing of all. The figure stepped slightly forward, just enough for the dim light to reveal a familiar outline, not familiar in identity, but in presence. It was like looking at a reflection that had evolved beyond recognition. "You're not here to fight," Arman finally said, his voice calm but sharp. A faint smile appeared. If I wanted to fight, you wouldn't be standing here. That answer didn't provoke anger. It confirmed something deeper. This wasn't about proving strength. It was about proving superiority of thought. Arman narrowed his gaze. Then, what is this? A correction. The word hung in the air, simple yet heavy. And in that moment, something shifted inside Arman. Not fear, but awareness. This person didn't see him as a rival. They saw him as a flaw in a system that needed improvement. The figure began to walk slowly, circling just enough to change angles, never breaking composure. You created a world where predators rise, they said. But you made one mistake. You believed reaching the top meant control. Arman stayed still, but his mind moved rapidly, analyzing every word, every pause. And you think you fixed that? I didn't fix it, the figure replied. I removed the illusion. A brief silence followed before they continued. You dominate systems. I erase them. You control people. I remove their need to resist. You became the apex predator, but I became the environment. That sentence landed differently. It wasn't arrogance, it was structure. A completely different way of thinking. Arman exhaled slowly. And what does that make me now? The answer came without hesitation, predictable. For the first time in years, Arman felt something. Close to pressure, not from force, but from realization. Every move he had made, every adaptation, every attempt to step outside the system, had still been within a pattern this person understood. He wasn't being outmatched physically. He was being outthought at a level he hadn't prepared for. But Arman didn't react emotionally. That had never been his way. Instead, he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not out of confidence, but recognition. You learned from me, he said quietly. The figure stopped. That's why you think you've surpassed me. Arman continued. Because you removed the weaknesses you saw in me. But that's the problem. For the first time, the figure didn't interrupt. You're still built on my foundation. That was the moment everything shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally. The balance that had been leaning in one direction paused. Because for the first time, the figure wasn't fully certain, and Arman saw it. Not in movement, not in expression, but in timing. A delay so small it would be invisible to anyone else. But to him it was enough. You became the environment, Arman said slowly. But environments can be changed. The air grew heavier, not with tension, but with possibility, because now the game wasn't about who was stronger or smarter, it was about who could redefine the rules faster, and in that moment, both of them understood the truth neither had spoken yet. This was no longer a hunt. No longer survival. This was transformation. The next move wouldn't decide who wins. It would decide what they both become. And somewhere beyond that abandoned structure, the city continued to breathe, unaware that the balance of its entire existence now rested on two minds, standing in silence, preparing to reshape everything. Nothing moved, yet everything had already begun to change. The space between Arman and the figure no longer felt like distance. It felt like a boundary between two realities, one built on control, the other on complete detachment. For years, Arman had mastered systems, bending them to his will, shaping outcomes before they unfolded. But now he stood before someone who didn't play within systems at all, someone who reshaped the very conditions in which systems existed. That realization should have been overwhelming, but instead it sharpened him. Because for the first time, Arman was no longer defending his position. He was redefining it. You're right, Arman said quietly, breaking the silence. I built patterns, and you learned to erase them. He took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not hesitant, deliberate. But you made the same mistake I did. The figure's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger, but in focus. You think stepping outside the system makes you untouchable, Arman continued. But the moment you act, you create a new pattern. Silence. Not empty, but shifting. Because that was the first idea neither of them had fully confronted. The figure responded, but this time there was a difference. Not in confidence, but in depth. Patterns are inevitable, they said. but I don't rely on them. I abandon them before they define me. Arman nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the truth in that. Then we're the same, he replied. No, the figure said instantly. You adapted to survive. I evolved to eliminate the need for survival. That line should have ended the conversation. It was precise, almost absolute, but Arman didn't step back. Instead, he did something neither of them had accounted for. He let go, not of control, not of awareness, but of the need to win. For years, every move Arman made had been driven by one core rule: never fall behind, never lose, never become prey. That rule had shaped him, sharpened him, and ultimately trapped him in an endless cycle. But standing here now, facing something beyond that cycle, he saw the flaw clearly. The game only exists if you agree to play it, and for the first time, Arman chose not to. The shift was invisible, but absolute. The figure felt it immediately. What are you doing? They asked, not out of confusion, but because something fundamental had just changed. Arman's expression was calm, almost lighter than before. Ending it. You can't end what defines this world. I can, Arman replied, by refusing to be defined by it. That answer broke something, not in reality, but in logic, because everything the figure had built, everything they had become, was based on the assumption that evolution must continue, that the cycle must persist. But what happens when someone steps outside not just the system, but the need for the system itself? For the first time, the figure had no immediate response. Not because they were weaker, not because they were defeated, but because they were facing something they had never calculated, a mind that no longer needed to compete. Arman turned slightly, not in surrender, but in completion. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the broken walls, still moving, still evolving, still trapped in the same silent struggle. But now, for the first time, he saw it differently, not as a battlefield, not as a system, but as a choice. He had spent his life becoming the strongest predator in a world that demanded it, only to realize strength was never the final answer. Freedom was. Behind him, the figure remained still, not chasing, not stopping him. Because deep down, they understood something unsettling. They could outthink him, outmaneuver him, outlast him, but they could not control someone who no longer needed control. And just like that, the balance shifted, not through a coup, not through strategy, but through awareness. The cycle of predator and prey didn't end. The world didn't suddenly change. The hunt didn't disappear, but one thing did, its hold over him.